Hi, I'm Caroline Bruce. I'm one of the training managers at the Bell Foundation, and I'm your e-moderator today for this webinar. So I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker, Tom, who'll be sharing with us today ideas around planning CPD on EAL for your own context, and how you might be able to draw on the Bell Foundation's classroom guidance and strategies to support EAL learners. Tom joined the Bell Foundation in 2020. He's worked in English language education since 2003, and he holds an MA in linguistics and is CELTA and Delta qualified. He's taught around the world and is particularly interested in international education and teacher development. Tom's highly experienced when it comes to designing CPD programs. He helped create the Bell Foundation's Language for Results international suite of online training courses, and he also works as an assessor for the Bell Foundation's ALFRE accreditation program. So we'll hand over to Tom now for what I know will be a really useful session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline, and hello everyone, welcome. It's great to see so many people here to talk about or hear about CPD. As we go through the session, please do feel free to add any questions or comments or experiences in the chat as we go along. It's always good to hear from people about their own, experiences and expertise, as well as listening to me. So this is what we're going to do for today's session. We'll start by looking at the importance of EAL CPD. We'll have a quick recap of our new support strategies document. And then for most of the session, we'll be looking at the practicalities of planning for CPD on EAL and also ideas for using the support strategies for CPD, as well as other ideas that we can implement for doing CPD activity around EAL. And there should be 5 or 10 minutes at the end for questions. So I'll start by briefly looking at why CPD on EAL is important. And obviously, I imagine I'm preaching to the converted in terms of the people who are attending this webinar, but I think it's really useful to reiterate and clarify why this is so needed, because we often may need to justify its importance to colleagues or other stakeholders. So let's take a moment to look at the expectations in terms of teachers here in the UK. And the most recent set of teaching standards say that teachers should be able to adapt their teaching to respond to the strengths and needs of all pupils. And that includes pupils who use English as an additional language. And teachers are expected to be able to use and evaluate different teaching approaches to engage and support them. So that's the expectation, but as we know, the reality can be a little bit different. And just to sort of set the scene, I guess, the reality at the moment in terms of what we're seeing, especially in England, but around the UK too, is that we know that almost 20% of learners in the UK are recorded as using EAL. And to quote Professor Constance Leung, EAL can now be fairly regarded as ordinary and permanent features of schooling education. So I don't think it's going anywhere. We're seeing changing demographics. So recently, for example, we've had EAL learners coming from Afghanistan, Hong Kong, and Ukraine, among others. And some schools that have previously had very few EAL learners are now seeing more of them and are in need of training to support those learners. We can also note that there is no expectation at the moment to provide EAL focused training or CPD at initial teacher training or in the early career framework. And we know that there is a general lack of confidence among teachers in their ability to support learners using EAL. Excuse me. With 40% of primary teachers and around 50% of secondary teachers expressing a lack of confidence in a 2022 teacher TAP survey. with, I think it was up to around 6,500 respondents. So staff are feeling ill prepared, and understandably so, I think, based on what we've just talked about. So what's the impact of that lack of sort of CPD support? Well, we know that language proficiency is crucial to academic achievement, and that EAL learners at bands A to C are less likely to reach the national average in national assessments. And we also know that those at bands D and E tend to overachieve the national average. In addition, we know that lack of effective support can have a negative impact on learners using EAL and their experience of school life more broadly. And just as an example of that, I want to just quote to you an extract from a study of EAL learners in mainstream classrooms in the UK from 2009, where the researcher observed the behaviour of primary pupils using EAL to be alone and withdrawn. And she commented that they are quiet, silent, left out, and unable to participate due to the language barrier. One of the pupils in her own diary calls herself sad at heart. And I don't know about you, but as an educator, obviously that makes me feel sad at heart, right? And I think it's a really important reminder that language is an integral part of each child's identity and who they are. So supporting these learners to be able to communicate is not just an academic concern. It's about helping children and young people feel comfortable and thrive at a personal and social level as well. And just to end on a positive, it is very reassuring for us here at the Bell Foundation to see that there is actually a real appetite for and commitment to CPD for EAL out there. And obviously we see that in our trainings and our interactions with schools. So there is a desire there. It's just how to manage that within the constraints that and the challenges that we're all facing at the moment. So I'm sure we don't need any further convincing that CPD on EAL is useful. So what can be done? And I want to have a look first at our new support strategies document. So just a quick recap on what the document looks like and how it's structured. Some of you may have attended our webinar on this last year that I think my colleague Sarah did. But if you didn't, I just want to point out the basic fact, which is there are two versions of these support strategy documents. Each has an identical structure and organization, but one is specific to primary and the other one is specific to secondary. The document is free to download and it's printable, and it lists strategies for different skills at each band. And it explains, excuse me, it explains and gives examples of how those strategies might be employed in a lesson. And there's links relevant to the resources as well towards to different resources, tools, and web pages and research as well. And perhaps the biggest difference to the old strategies document that we had is that we've also organized all the information according to our 5 key principles for EAL, and you can see them laid out there. And if you want more depth on that, please go to our website. We've got some lovely free downloadable posters if you want to start, papering it up on every surface at school to try and get those messages across. Please go ahead. So in practice then, the bulk of the support strategy document is organized like this. And here's an example from our secondary document. So you'll see each document is divided by band, and there's a different color for each band. So you've got green at band A, red at band B, and so on. And each band is divided into 2 sections by skill. So there's a listening and speaking section and a reading, viewing, and writing section. And then each of those sections is divided by the 5 principles, and listed below each principle are the relevant strategies and resources. So just to give another example, if, for example, you have some students in Band C and you'd like some guidance on assessing their written English, you can go to the Band C section for reading and writing, and then scroll down until you get to the assessment principle, and you'll find a list of ideas and guidance. Another useful feature is that each skill section within each band comes with an example of what this might look like in practice. So for primary Band A, in the speaking and listening section, for example, there is a description of a geography themed lesson about the seasons. And this is presented as a table with one column showing what the teacher is doing, another column talking about what the class are doing, and the third column describing what an individual pupil using EAL at that level, so what a Band A learner in this case would be doing at each stage of the lesson. And it's just to give a flavor or glimpse of how those ideas might actually get applied and what that looks like for the teacher, for the individuals using EAL we're trying to support, as well as their classmates. And it's important to note that these are not lesson plans. They are just kind of snapshots, but we'll explore later how they might still be useful in doing CPD, especially around lesson planning and things like that for EAL. Okay. So having refreshed our memories on the support strategies, let's look at how we can apply them to help with CPD. And we're going to start first with how they might inform our decision making and planning around CPD activity. Excuse me. I do appreciate many teaching staff may not have much time or the mental space for a lot of strategic planning for things like this. But even at an informal ad hoc level, I think it's possible to put some thought into how we approach CPD in a way that's going to make it more impactful and effective. So let's explore that a little bit. And if we're thinking about effective CPD, we want to start with understanding what is the key information and the changes in thinking that we need to facilitate. And I think this model can help us. So Garcia and Klein identified 3 strands of CPD for successful multilingual education. First of all, they talk about understanding multilingual students and their families. So this might involve, cultural awareness training, or ensuring that staff know where to find the information that you've gathered about the EAL students at your school. Things like what languages they speak at home, how literate they are in their home languages, or it could be information about the culture of the country they're coming from. For example, the Bell Foundation did a webinar on the Ukrainian education system with a Ukrainian educator in a couple of years ago, to kind of give that context and background when we had so many new arrivals from Ukraine. The second strand is knowledge of language and multilingualism. So what we mean really is having a basic understanding of how children acquire language, how long it can take, what types of language might be difficult, the importance of maintaining home language abilities and literacy, and the positive effects that can have on English acquisition. And I think in the UK, especially if you're working in quite a monolingual environment, this is really important. And it's something that I think a lot of teachers can be a little bit nervous about or afraid of. We tend in this country to see languages as something that are really difficult, that are scary. So it's really just about kind of softening that view and just making it seem a bit less terrifying to people, because that can often be the initial response, I think, that a lot of people have to other languages. And the third strand is probably what most of us would think about when we think about EAL for CPD, and that's awareness of pedagogy for multilingual pupils, and the practical techniques and strategies that we might employ to support them. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a sip of water because my throat has got a tickle. So just excuse me for a second. There we go. Back with you. All right. So we can think of these three in two groups. We can think of the first set of strands as the why. Okay. This is the reason why these strategies are important. And the third strand is all about the how. And whilst it's very tempting to focus on the how side of things and just kind of, give ideas, give strategies, give that practical information that teachers need and want, in my experience, it is really important to spend a little bit of time and a little bit of thought on the why side of things as well, because that's where you get the buy-in and the engagement, and the knowledge and the confidence that allows people to implement the how part more successfully. So even if it is just a couple of slides at the beginning or a little discussion or something like that, I think it can be really important and quite powerful to include all of these areas. Okay. So one place where the support strategies can be helpful is in deciding what exactly to focus on in terms of CPD on EAL, because obviously that's a really large area and it can be a case of like, where on earth do I start? So you can use the strategies to determine where that might be. For example, you might want to choose a particular principle and build some CPD activity around that. For example, you may decide that subject teachers need to learn more strategies for integrating curricular learning and language support. So you could use those sections of the document as your starting point. You may have identified a need for support for EAL learners at a particular level of proficiency. So, most obviously, if you have some new to English children who are newly arrived, maybe they will need the targeted support as a priority. So again, this will help you narrow down the types of strategies and ideas that you might want to focus on in any CPD. You may even want to focus on strategies for developing particular skills. So if you notice there's an imbalance between proficiency scores in listening and speaking compared to reading and writing, for example, then you might want to narrow those ideas down using the support strategy. So you may just want to focus on the reading and writing, or just the reading, or just the speaking, or whatever it is where the students need the support. If you're not sure where to start when it comes to understanding your own school's EAL provision, and you're just kind of at a bit of a loss, we do have a self-evaluation toolkit available for free on our website. So once a focus has been agreed, you can then move on to thinking about the planning and evaluation of CPD activity. So I'm just going to get a bit technical here, and I don't want to scare everyone off. I promise I'm going to get a bit more practical in a minute. But when we're talking about effective CPD, it's really useful to think about how you're going to evaluate that CPD before you start planning. And some of you may be familiar with this framework already, but Guskey lists 5 areas against which he suggests we can evaluate the effectiveness of any CPD. I'm just going to go through them briefly, and then I will explain why these are relevant. So just bear with me. So, the first thing we can do is measure participant reactions. Are they happy? Are they smiling? Are they sitting there with their arms folded, rolling their eyes? We can also obviously measure that through things like questionnaires. We also might want to measure the participants' learning, or at least what they report having learned as a result of the CPD. Again, often via things like exit tickets or questionnaires. we may want to measure to what extent there's alignment between the CPD activity we're doing and the school's policies and practices. Maybe that's something more of a sort of strategic kind of leadership perspective on things. But if there is a CPD plan in your school or whatever, or a particular set of goals for the year, how well does that align with those? And fourth, you may also want to measure how the participants or the recipients of the CPD are using their new knowledge or skills, which would typically involve maybe some kind of classroom observation. And lastly, and probably most importantly, but also most difficult, most fraught, is measuring the impact on student learning. And obviously notoriously difficult to do, but let's imagine we want to improve students' writing and we do some CPD around developing writing, then we might be able to use their writing scores as evidence of potentially that having an impact. So why am I talking about evaluating CPD when we haven't even begun talking about what it might look like? Well, there is a reason. This suggestion actually comes from my colleague, Sylvana Richardson. It's her idea, but she recommends turning these 5 levels kind of upside down and making them into questions that we can ask ourselves to help guide us towards what we actually want to achieve with any CPD activity we have planned, and how we might best go about doing that. So we can think of it as kind of reverse engineering effective CPD, basically. So we can ask ourselves the following questions then. Thinking about student impact first, what are the areas of student learning we want to improve? In terms of skills and knowledge, what are the practices and strategies that we need to achieve those outcomes? In terms of whole school practice and policy and leadership, what organizational supports need to be in place for this CPD to succeed? That might just be something as simple as, support, moral support from the senior leadership team. If ideally it might be more than that, like change, resourcing or changes to the timetable to facilitate something or things like that. Thinking of staff learning, what knowledge and skills does staff need to be able to put into practice the strategies that we identified in part 2? And lastly, assuming we want our staff to have a positive experience with their CPD, then what CPD strategies are going to be most efficient and most effective, and hopefully also inspire those positive reactions and the kind of buy-in that we know really is really important with effective and impactful CPD. So okay, that was the sort of technical bit over, but for anyone involved in CPD planning, maybe that's helpful to you. So we'll explore some of more practical ideas now, and we're going to do that by looking through the lens of a couple of case studies. So these case studies are invented, if you like, and they're not meant to be like best practice. This is what you should be doing. They're meant to represent different approaches and different strategies that you could take towards your CPD, as a way of you then maybe cherry picking the ideas that resonate with you or you think might be helpful, just to sort of as a disclaimer before we start. So our first case study then, it's a primary school and it's mainly monolingual, both in terms of its student cohort and its staff. And so there's not much history or experience of EAL learners in this school. There's been a sudden increase, excuse me, there's been a sudden increase of new arrivals using EAL, mainly from Ukraine. And the school have recognized that there is a need for more EAL support. And so they have recruited a new EAL lead, but actually they've just assigned that role to the SEND coordinator. and that teacher is new to EAL support. So also in this school, I think it's fair to say there's some old-fashioned attitudes to multilingualism. So it's very well-meaning, but I think staff and students might have a bit of resistance to using and hearing languages other than English in the classroom. And there's an over-reliance of translating tools for communication and a general sort of lack of confidence about working with and communicating with learners using EAL. And lastly, because the EAL learners into the school are new arrivals, generally speaking, there isn't any formal assessment process that's been embedded. So support at the moment is quite untargeted, quite piecemeal, and not very efficient. So the head teacher at the school has asked our EAL lead to help the staff with this new cohort. That's our scenario. So our resourceful new EAL lead then, let's imagine she has a skim read through our support strategies document, and based on some chats with the head teacher, she decides to prioritize 3 different areas. And she's using the principles laid out in the support strategies as a kind of guide or a sort of hook to hang these on. So the first one is making new arrivals feel more welcome and helping them get more involved in school life, which we can see, I think, links quite naturally to the social inclusion principle. The second challenge is helping staff understand their EAL pupils better and feel more confident exploiting their existing language skills, and reducing the sort of fear, I guess, of hearing other languages in their classrooms. And I think that links very obviously as well to the multilingualism as an asset principle. And lastly, they want to find a way of assessing new arrivals' language proficiency and setting relevant targets for development, which obviously links directly to effective pupil assessment. And if we go back to the questions we looked at earlier, in terms of our EAL lead here, sort of thinking ahead and planning, looking at the challenges she's faced with, she might respond to these questions something like this. So in terms of the areas of student learning, she wants to improve basic social and classroom language and the ability to participate in those curricular activities. The kind of strategies they might need would be, exploiting home languages, using visual supports, and providing comprehensible input, especially in instruction giving. In terms of organizational support, there may be a need for a kind of shared space for EAL information in whatever online system the school has, as well as buy-in from senior leadership. And this teaching staff will need to know when and how to use home languages to support learning. They will need to be able to scaffold their instructions and also identify language targets for those learners to keep improving their English. And the EAL lead understands that, there's not a lot of scope for doing anything outside of what already exists at the school. So any CPD's got to work within the existing system, which at this school looks like weekly insets. There are teacher meets as well set up, and classroom visits. There's a culture in this school of teachers visiting each other's classrooms and doing observations and stuff like that. So based on that scenario, what actions does she decide? Well, first of all, there's a discussion with the head teacher to sort of get that buy-in and to understand and to sort of share her ideas. And they agree that there will be 3 inset sessions spread across the term. This may not be very realistic in an actual school. I appreciate that, but go with it because I'm going to use that as a framework to show some examples. They also agree that the EAL lead is going to visit some classrooms and watch the newly arrived students and observe how they are doing, making notes on where the main challenges are the students are facing, and also where they are getting involved and what they're able to do, so that she can build her kind of knowledge and understanding of what they're up to. So let's have a look at what those inset ideas could look like. I've tried to include sort of ideas that might be quite relatively easy to replicate and do on the ground. So the first inset then is addressing the need for more language awareness in the school and developing, I guess, a more multilingual mindset. And they invite the head teacher to the session and she agrees to attend. And obviously that's really important because it'll benefit her, but also it sets the tone for the rest of the school as well. And our EAL lead and one of the TAs, who is Slovakian, come up with what I'm going to call in their shoes experience. And many of you may have done something similar in your contexts, but it's this idea of doing an activity in a foreign language to the team of teaching staff in the room to give them that experience of what it's like, that firsthand sort of really visceral experience of being in the student's shoes and feeling what it's like when you don't understand. So in this case, the Slovakian TA, let's call her Zuzana, she talks through some slides that they've prepared about new arrivals, but entirely in Slovakian. All the text is in Slovakian. There are no visuals, and she doesn't make any accommodations in her speech. So, you know, they get that sort of full shock factor. And that leads to a discussion about how it felt, what kind of things could have been done to make it more accessible. And, you know, you could leave it there if you're short of time, but often in an ideal world, you might want to repeat the presentation again if you have a member of staff with the right skills to, you know, with all the right accommodations included. So they could repeat it, but using the support strategies with visuals, by slowing down, by chunking up the content, providing thinking time, etc., etc. And, you know, that's often very powerful first-hand way to convey how, even if you don't speak a word of the language, there are a lot of non-verbal communication cues that you can use that will convey quite a lot of meaning. So the next part of the inset then, that would be 5 or 10 minutes. The next part of the inset is a short presentation about Ukrainian culture and their education system. So I mentioned before, maybe they took some of that information from the Bell Foundation website and the resource I mentioned before. And they make it a bit interactive with a multiple choice quiz element to build in some discussion. And lastly, there's a collaborative discussion among the teachers to kind of agree some quick wins, some, you know, simple actions that they can do straight away. And to support that, our EAL lead provides a copy of the A and B support strategies for social inclusion, as well as multilingualism as an asset. So just sections of the document, because it's quite long, and if we give teachers the whole thing, they're just going to be overwhelmed. And that allows them to maybe work in their year group teams to identify the quick wins that could be implemented straight away. And each group then can agree 2 or 3 actions that they can start doing ASAP with their multilingual pupils. And then the head teachers there as well, and along with the EAL lead, they can note down any sort of longer term actions and ideas as well that spring out of those discussions that maybe can be implemented later as well. So that's our first example of the inset. The second one focuses on those classroom strategies for language development. So this might look like reading the relevant support strategy pages. I think the 2 most useful ones here might be integrating content and language, and also the high expectations strategies, again, picked from bands A and B for this context because the new arrivals have got very limited English. And then maybe doing a strategy stations activity. So by that, I mean setting up some tables or spaces in the room. Each space has its own strategy with a QR code or with physical examples and resources demonstrating that particular resource. So that could link, for example, to the Bell Foundation Great Ideas pages, where there are videos and explanations of how these strategies work, or whatever other resources that you might find relevant. And teachers then can go to whichever strategy interests them most or would most benefit their learners and learn about that. And then that would end with teaching staff choosing a particular strategy to try out, whether that could be done as individuals or in teams and small groups. And then the next time out, when there's a teachers meet, there could be a brief sharing of experiences, for example, to make recommendations. That's just one possible approach to something like this. Notice that there's that sharing of experiences is kind of really important, because it's where that reflection and evaluation happens, and it allows you to then have that kind of quality control process of what's working, what isn't working, what works for us, what doesn't, and then you can hopefully kind of build on that. And the third inset would be focused exactly on assessment and assessing our EAL pupils. So again, you could do something like introducing the Bell Foundation assessment bands. You could provide some authentic student writing or speaking samples for teachers to assess against the descriptors taken from pupils at the school. The teachers could agree on strengths and also set targets for development based on those samples. And as a follow-up piece of activity, they could use the strategies document to select ideas to help students reach those targets. And another way of doing this that I've seen work quite successfully is teachers choosing a student to follow as a kind of training process, I guess, where they maybe use the tool just with one student to begin with, and they also kind of keep an eye on that student. Again, this works well in the primary context, where there tends to be the same teacher with the student throughout the day, and they can kind of follow that student, keep an eye on them, and then they use them as that sort of case study. And then once they're feeling more comfortable with using the framework to assess that single student, you can then broaden that out to be used with more widely across the school. Okay, our second case study. This is School 2. It's a secondary school in an urban area of the country. It's highly multilingual, and the school have assessment systems in place for tracking progress because they're very used to large numbers of EAL learners. There are several large established language communities within the school and the local community, in addition to other language groups as well. And there are staff at the school who speak the community languages of those students as well. However, staff turnover has been an issue recently, and a lot of staff with more confidence around EAL have moved on. And there are quite a few early career teachers with minimal EAL experience coming into the school. And another recurring issue is that multilingual pupils are often plateauing at around Band C, and that's harming their chances of achieving better exam grades. A bigger picture to this is that there's a whole school drive at the moment to improve writing standards, but not specifically targeted at EAL pupils. And there is quite an experienced and expert EAL coordinator at this school. They're lucky to have. So based on what we've heard, then, maybe our EAL coordinator, in collaboration with the school leadership, identifies some priorities they want to focus on, which in this case might be moving the students beyond that Band C level up to Bands D and E. That probably links to that high expectations section of the sports strategies. The second priority would be improving the social integration of the groups who aren't mixing very well in the school, which obviously links to the social inclusion aspect. And lastly, there's that focus on improving reading and writing, especially for those Band C learners, because actually that's where they're really struggling. Their speaking and listening's okay. It's that reading and writing where they're finding it difficult. So returning to our questions, our EAL coordinator is asking himself, well, in terms of areas of student learning, if we drill down a little bit, they want to improve the students' ability to read those academic texts, to increase their academic vocabulary, especially that sort of tier 2 vocabulary, the vocabulary that co-occurs across different curricular areas, and really developing their ability to write those longer texts, which will require to succeed in all their projects and exams and things like that as they move through secondary school. That will require things like being able to integrate vocabulary development activities into curricular lessons, providing scaffolding through things like graphic organizers, and maybe techniques like talk for writing, which again, especially with learners who are a bit more confident with their spoken English compared to their written English, can be quite powerful. Again, there'll need to be that buy-in from the senior leadership, and teachers are going to need to know concrete details of activities for scaffolding for reading and writing, perhaps things like the kind of types and functions of graphic organizers and how to create them, of course. So, that might be important for teachers who are less confident with IT and things like that. So, yeah, it's one thing to know about something, it's another thing knowing how to create it. And at this school, in terms of what kind of CPD strategies might be available, they're thinking about early career teacher and mentor meetings. In the past, this school had EAL champions. I'll talk about those in a minute. Department meetings for subject specialists, and collaborative planning is something that the EAL coordinator is quite passionate about and knows is very useful tool. So then, what kind of initial actions could happen here? Well, I think one thing that's really important if you're doing CPD, in my experience, especially if you want to get senior leadership to take notice, is data collection. So our EAL coordinator collects data on all the EAL learners to evidence exactly which groups need support and highlight those disparities we were talking about earlier in speaking and listening and reading and writing, along with the impact it's having on results. And then there's a meeting with senior leadership to present this data and set out some of those solutions mentioned to get some buy-in, as well as other ideas and input. The EAL coordinator also includes a sort of case study of one of the students he teaches to show how they kind of moved through the school, and how the lack of strategies has been impacting them. And I add that example, that detail, to show that it's important to provide evidence of different types when you're, especially when you're presenting to leadership, for example. It's about knowing your audience, because some people prefer hard data, but other people might be more persuaded by storytelling and things like that. Just something to bear in mind. So perhaps there's a meeting with the senior leadership to present this data, as we've mentioned. And thirdly, the EAL coordinator goes out there to recruit a fresh group of EAL champions from different subject areas. So these are teachers that he knows already have some EAL knowledge, and or are really keen to learn and try new things. Those teachers that are sort of natural experimenters and quite enjoy trying out those new ideas in the classroom. They're often really useful allies to have when you're trying to embed new practices. Another approach to this, which I've seen used quite successfully, is alongside those EAL champions, it's also worth approaching maybe one or two of the skeptics in the teaching cohort. The ones who will be sitting there with their arms folded, rolling their eyes, who've seen it all, and recruiting them as kind of critical friends for if you're trying to implement new ideas, because Well, firstly, you can just, they'll really enjoy picking holes and tearing apart every aspect of your plan and telling you in great detail why it won't work. But actually, that can be quite useful because it gives you insight into kind of what their perceived barriers are to implementing change. And that actually can allow you to sort of think about, well, okay, how am I going to, what kind of scaffolding can I create to help support them integrate these ideas I've got? Maybe it's like saying, maybe it's they're worried about IT um, or whatever it might be. Maybe they're worried about being able to translate things effectively, and so it just allows you to kind of then maybe tailor your support. So yeah, as well as your super keen, eager EAL champions, it can be sometimes useful to have critical friends on board too. All right, so in the shorter term, then our EAL coordinator holds some subject-specific discussions with the EAL champions, as well as some of the early career teacher mentors, based around the exemplars from the support strategies. So just basically as a hook on which to have a bit of a discussion about what kind of strategies would work in your lessons for your students in your subject. And the EAL champions then can select and try out some of those techniques that they think will be most useful for them in their context. And those ideas can be shared with the ECT mentors as well, so that they can pass those on to the early career teachers. In the medium term, the EAL coordinator and one of the EAL champions decide to do some learning walks in the school. So they pop into lessons and they're able to notice where there's good practice, notice things that are working and being and then sharing those with the wider school team. There's schools have loads of different ways of sharing information. I can imagine you might have a shared document, for example. I've seen some schools have kind of shared documents like a staff Padlet or something, where you might post images or ideas of effective practice that you've seen that everyone can see. The senior leadership team in the school agree to include some EAL support strategies for writing support in their observation pro forma. So, and that's communicated with the whole school, the whole teaching staff, by the senior leadership team. And so teachers know that in the following year's observations, they'll be expected to use some support strategies. And so again, that's hopefully kind of giving people that idea that this is something to be taken seriously. And it's also important to note that they're not specifying what kind of strategies are being used. That's left open to the individuals and the teachers, but it's about having some kind of support strategy, and fits into their whole school approach to improving and developing writing. Those effective strategies are shared by the EAL champions. So the EAL champions have been experimenting with their ideas, and then they're able to then go to their departmental meetings, share what works, what hasn't, and they can use examples backed up with the things they've been doing in the class. So for example, maybe the science teacher's been using writing frames for producing experiments, write-ups. Maybe the English literature teacher's been producing substitution tables to help learners describe characters, whatever that might be. And lastly, the EAL coordinator has arranged to use those findings to inform future curriculum planning via some collaborative planning. So basically, they're meeting with he's meeting with department heads to inform the curriculum planning for the following year. This may not sound like a CPD, but honestly, some of the most effective schools I've seen when it comes to EAL provision often have some sort of co-planning thing between the kind of EAL specialists and subject specialists, because there's kind of it's CPD for both parties, right? The EAL specialists kind of get to understand more deeply what's happening in the subject areas, and the department heads are hearing about, okay, how can I, EALify my curriculum? How can I make it more supportive for those learners? And again, it's not about rewriting the whole thing. It's about introducing strategies that will work for all learners, but are also useful for EAL learners as well. So I guess these examples from the secondary school are a little bit more of like a holistic approach to CPD, rather than a kind of, I guess, inset model. But the idea was just to flag up some alternative approaches. Again, it's really not meant to be, this is what you should do. There's no such thing as best practice, would be my advice when it comes to CPD. There's only effective practice, what works in your school, in your context, with your students, taking into account the constraints and the opportunities that you have in your school. So just as a quick summary then, I won't go through all of these, but these are kind of types of inset that you might want to apply and do in your school if you have an inset based approach to a CPD. I think my consideration would be that inset sessions are really good for addressing those kind of why questions and for providing information to people. They're not sufficient for transferability of behavior and of action in the classroom. So you might want to think about what else needs to happen to embed classroom practice, for example. And we also have a little summary there of some of the non-inset kind of CPD activities I've mentioned. And again, my personal favorite would be that sort of joint planning, which I know is really hard because it relies on there being an individual with sort of EAL expert and having time to sit down with somebody else. But I've seen that be very powerful. And just to end with sort of final thought, is a quote here where it says, inclusive pedagogies, unless properly resourced with appropriate teacher expertise and knowledge, may fail the very students they set out to support. So, even with the best will in the world, unless there is that expertise and knowledge behind them, we're not always supporting the students to the levels that we want to be able to do. Okay, Caroline, I think I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Tom. That was really great. Really, really useful session. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We've got a few minutes to just do a couple of questions, if that's okay. So we haven't had loads of questions come in. So I'll give you a couple that came in by email first. So is there any training or strategies on how we can use AI effectively when planning for EAL learners? And this person's been trying out Copilot for translation and also to differentiate. And would be grateful for any tips. So.
Okay, well, yeah, not exactly on topic, but I mean it's a big topic at the moment. Personally, I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert in AI, but I do take quite an interest in what's going on. So all I would direct you towards is I can give you some names of people that I've found useful to follow on social media around EdTech in the EAL. So the first one that springs to mind would be a guy called Joe Dale, who is an EdTech kind of specialist and also an MFL teacher. And he's always posting really interesting stuff, just about MFL in general, but specifically he's doing a lot of stuff on AI recently that's connected to language learning. There's a guy called Nick Peachy, who is an EALT educator. So he's coming at it from an English language teaching background, but again, he also highlights and signposts a lot of really useful content around using AI. And there's another guy that I follow on LinkedIn called Matthew Vimes. I don't know how to pronounce his surname, but I think Caroline,
Yeah,
maybe
I'm on
type
it.
it in the chat. and he's a teacher at an international school. I think he's a technology teacher, but he's always posting lots of really interesting content and ideas about how he's been using it. Um, yeah, I don't know about Copilot that much. I attended a session at Oxford University on AI on Friday, and there was a guy from Microsoft who worked directly on Copilot, and he was showing us all the clever things it can do if you buy the sort of swanky paid version that's going to be coming out soon, which does look quite impressive. But I also imagine most schools won't have access to that necessarily immediately. So good luck.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for that, Tom. We've got a couple of questions as well around assessment. A question from Julie asking about assessment for new EAL students in secondary schools. And then I think she put something else in the chat as well. Where can I find assessment papers for our new EAL students? So I'm assuming, Julie, that you're referring to a test, because I shared the Bell Foundation's assessment framework. So I don't know if it's a specific test that you're looking for. Tom, I don't know if you want to
Well, I
speak
mean,
around that,
you could
or do
probably
you want me
speak
to
to
do
it
it?
better than me, but I think yeah, the short answer for us is there is no
No.
assessment tool that goes with our framework. That's basically because it's very, very difficult to create a good one that would be
Yeah,
valid and reliable, and it, there's it's a hard thing to actually assess somebody's ability to use language across the whole curriculum, right? If you imagine we
yeah.
examine people in different subjects, how do you assess them across all subjects in one test?
I think
It's a
that's the
challenge.
key point, is that the Bell Foundation's assessment framework is curriculum related rather
Yeah,
than a separate language assessment. So there isn't a test to sit with it. And so we very much recommend task-based assessments. And then a similar question, would you recommend that subject teachers use the assessment framework themselves alongside the EAL lead to get a clearer picture? Overall, having just one person assess a large number of students can be really time consuming. I'm not sure whether that's from secondary or primary, but I'm guessing secondary with
they're
the
saying
use of
subject
subject
teachers
teachers.
probably. Yeah.
Yeah,
But again, I'm sure you could speak to this better than me. But yeah, absolutely get them on board. I mean, it was designed for
definitely.
subject teachers, but it was designed for non-language specialists to be able to use. I would say it does help if you've got an EAL specialist there, kind of helping support that and sort of mediating, because some of the language and terminology and stuff might be a bit unclear. But yeah, absolutely.
There's, I mean, Tom's suggestion earlier of having the EAL champions works really well. So having somebody that can, maybe from different departments, who can work with the EAL lead to get a really good understanding of assessment and be involved in some moderation and be able to support members of their department. That tends to work really well. But I would absolutely agree, it's too big a task for one person, and also it's really useful for everybody to be as involved as possible. I saw that somebody had asked a question in the chat about SATs, and now I can't see it. I think it was about SATs papers. We haven't got anything on SATs papers, but we will have. Are there any recommended provisions for Year 6 SATs papers for translations? Oh, it's such a good question. We've got articles that are going to SecEd and HTU on access arrangements. They've gone today, so we're hoping that they'll be published very soon. It's very much about finding out local provision in terms of translators. So you are able to open the maths papers an hour early to translate those. If you're able to. An hour isn't very long though, is it? So it's a big task. Some local authorities are able to offer support with interpretation and translation, so it's worth checking with local authority first, I'd say, and they might be able to signpost you elsewhere if necessary. I'm just trying to see if there's any other questions, and also noticing that it's 5 o'clock.
Do you want me to?
Fab. Thanks, Tom. So just to let you know of some courses that we've got coming up. So we've got supporting new arrivals who are new to English coming up in April, and embedding EAL assessment coming up in June. So the QR code there is for the site where you can the page where you can actually see those courses and log on. And on the next slide then, Tom, there's also a webinar that we've got coming up, which is on we are launching a MOOC which will be free on Introduction to EAL Assessment, and this webinar will be the launch of it. We will also have, although this isn't available on the website yet, we will also be having a webinar to launch some guidance on using the same strategies with intervention groups. So watch out for that one as well. And then really delighted to be doing a piece of work with Governors for Schools. So next Monday, we will be hosting a webinar with Governors for Schools on how governors can support their schools in developing provision for learners who use EAL. So it'd be great if you can share the link there with any of the governors in your schools or the relevant person. I realise it's very short notice, so thank you. So and that's it from us. So thanks so
Yeah, thank
much
you,
for
everyone.
joining us,
Have a
and
good evening.
yeah, have a really lovely evening. Thanks a lot. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.